So, in the last video, I showed you guys how I make puzzle cubes and what my approach is. Yours may be different, that's totally okay. Now we're going to do something a little bit different. So, before we leave, I think it's only right that we rename our document to accurately reflect what we just made. That way when we're looking back on it later, it's easier for us to know what's in this document. So I'm going to rename this and I'm going to call it Puzzle Cube. And then I hit enter and it renames it. So I want to go back and create a totally new document because right now we are going to design the wheel for our robot. So I'm going to click on Onshape, click on the logo, it brings you back to this, and I'll show you just an example of what wheel we are designing. So we're going to be designing this wheel to be 3D printed. And 3D printing is really an amazing technology. And there are certain things that you have to consider when you're designing to 3D print something. We'll get into that in this episode. So here are the 3D printed wheels on the robot. Again, it takes a little bit to load, especially as you get more and more complex files and parts, but it's worth it once it does load. So while we're waiting, on the subject of making things with 3D printing, let's just do a quick Google and look at what goes on with the 3D print. So let's look up 3D printer. And we see all these pretty fancy machines, but a lot of them look kind of similar. They're all doing really similar things. This kind of 3D printing, and this is actually the model of 3D printer that we use when we print the parts for the robot, is really kind of like 2D printing, but just moving up every step. So what it's doing is creating a tiny little layer like this, and then just moving up a little bit. And I can show you an example of that with this squirrel. So coming back to this is called Cura. This is a program that basically takes a CAD model like we were creating and turns it into language that our 3D printer can understand. So if I go over here and I click on layers, I can see layer by layer what's happening, what the 3D printer is doing. So here is the inside of our squirrel. And if you notice this little grid right here, what that is called infill. And infill is what determines how solid or how hollow the squirrel is. So if I just look at this squirrel normally, you have no idea if it's hollow or solid. But if this was solid, it took a really long time to print. To give you an example, the number that matters right here is this fill density. I'm going to turn this to 100 and hit enter. So that takes 1 hour and 49 minutes versus if this was at 15, taking only 31 minutes. So let's just look at it though, if it is at 100. So if it's at 100, and I go right here to layers, I can see that it's just solid, completely solid. Alternatively, if I go over here and I click 3%, it is a lot more empty. So I see barely any infill. Infill is great for making your parts strong, but again, it does take more time and use more filament. So, back to our 3D printers. If we want to design something to be 3D printed, there's a few things to consider. One of which is this thing called overhang. So if you see with this, let me just Google. So these are giving some pretty good examples. If you look at these parts right here, they are examples of overhang, where if it was printing just straight up, it'd be fine, but it's actually printing at an angle. And because it's depositing every layer, sometimes what you'll see is these little droops. And there's just certain angles that will work well. And if you see, like this one's trying to bridge all the way out, and it's just getting really messy. So as a general rule, if the corner of an overhang that you're designing is within like 60 degrees, I prefer 45, it won't overhang. But if it's like 90 degrees like this, it won't be able to print it. You'll get these droopy messes like this. So enough of that tangent. Looks like our robot is loaded. So these are the wheels that you'll be designing today. And you'll 3D print them and then they'll run on your robot. And the cool thing about this is you can make it look like however you want. If you want to have your initials right in the wheel, or if you want to do a really cool design, you can. And in these next videos, I'm going to walk you through how to do that. So I'll see you guys in the next video.